This is Barry Hersh, uh, Clinical Associate Professor at the New York University Schack Institute of Real Estate. This is one of our faculty webinar series that we've actually been doing since the pandemic started. And it's an opportunity to talk with leaders in real estate. And we have a discussion today about an extraordinary project, one that I think is really exciting, has all the bells and whistles uh, on the water in a city, uh, uh, tax increment financing, opportunity zone, sustainability, all kinds of aspects of it. And of course, it's a fairly substantial project, as you'll be hearing. So we have two guests who will really do a vast majority of the speaking. If you have any questions, put them in chat. If I think they are timely, I can interject. Or we will have some time at the end for questions. There is actually two PowerPoint presentations and a brief video. So I think that's all the logistics. With that, so let me introduce Adam Jen, who is managing director of Ballard Development and who is the guy who's really running this project. And we'll talk about it and can go into all the aspects of it. And it is, as I said, an extraordinary project with a lot of facets. The second speaker is Mark Pollak, and he and I go back far further than either of us want to mention. And but by the way, Adam is a graduate of the CARI Graduate Real Estate Program, so he understands what graduate real estate students are interested in. And Mark is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, law and planning, and has been involved in major projects throughout the Mid-Atlantic for a long career. He is a real estate partner at Ballard, Spahr, and has been involved in the effort for Port Covington from its beginning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam.
No, Mark.
Oh, Mark. Okay, we'll turn it over to Mark.
That's all right, Barry. That's all right. Well, let me just say, Port Covington is a fascinating project, not just because we've been working on it for the last 9 years, but because it is, by a variety of measures, one of the biggest urban renewal projects in the country. For a long while, we like to compare ourselves to Hudson Yards and suggest that somehow we were the second biggest urban renewal project in the country. I don't know if that's any longer the case, but it is a most significant project for Baltimore. It is by far the biggest project that's been undertaken in the city in quite some time, if not ever. Initially, Port Covington was looked at as a prospective headquarters for Under Armour's explosive growth. But things have changed. It's no longer just an Under Armour global campus potentially. It is now a project in and of itself with the potential to do upwards of 18 million square feet of development, involving upwards of $6 billion of investment, both private and public. So it's quite an amazing project for a city like Baltimore that's taken its hits in the media of late, and somewhat deservedly, unfortunately. But nonetheless, it's an important project, and a lot of the project's potential is dependent upon faith in the future. And that, I think, is critical to recognize here. So let me start off by, for those who are not from Baltimore, let's see, am I doing this right, Barry?
I don't see your screen.
I'm trying to share screen, but oh well. Adam, can you put yours up?
Yes, I can.
All right. Let me kill this one, whatever this thing is. Yeah, this is a nice rendering of Port Covington, what it looked like a little while ago before we really started active development. Port Covington is everything south of that major highway you see running east to west. We're looking north in this particular slide. That's Interstate 95. Upwards of 250,000 cars pass by there every day. And Port Covington is the peninsula south of Interstate 95. It's about 270 acres. And I guess the best way to describe it is it's 20 miles north of Washington, D.C. It's right along the major north-south route, Interstate 95. And it has an interesting history, which is probably worth a few minutes describing. Back in the 19th century, this waterfront area was a recreational area. It had a beach, it had all sorts of facilities. But by the mid 20th century, it had become a rail yard for the Western Maryland Railroad. We have a slide that I'm not going to be able to show, obviously, but it was basically covered with with tracks. Sometime towards the 1980s, the beginning of the 1980s, rail essentially was no longer an essential element. And CSX, which had acquired the Western Maryland Railroad, was looking for ways to make that land a bit more valuable than it was as a site filled with railroad tracks all over the place. And at the same time, the Baltimore Sun, which was a major institution at that time, it's now just part of the fading print press, was looking to develop a new printing plant on which it was prepared to spend $250 million. So the city undertook to convince the Sun to build its printing plant at Port Covington, and for CSX to sell to the Baltimore Sun the land required to do that. And at the same time to have the CSX to undertake to develop the site as a suburban type industrial park. Well, the Sun fulfilled its part of the bargain. It spent $250 million and it built the printing plant, which you can still see in the center of the green space. I don't know if Adam, that's it, right? But unfortunately, CSX really couldn't do what it thought it could do with regard to selling this as an industrial park. It ended up selling the land to a variety of developers, one of which could do not much more than attract Walmart to the site, so that Walmart ended up building a Sam's Club and a standard Walmart market with the back of the facility facing the water. I don't know if you can misuse a waterfront facility any worse than that, but that's pretty much what that developer did. Rumor has it that back in 2012, Kevin Plank, who was the founder and CEO of Under Armour, was taking a boat ride and noticed Port Covington. And at the time, Under Armour was facing explosive growth, as I said, and was looking for a place to expand. And unfortunately, it really could not expand at its existing location, which was also in the near vicinity of Port Covington, because it was hemmed in by a residential project, by a Domino's sugar facility and other such institutional purposes that really could not be reprogrammed. So beginning in 2012, we started acquiring portions of the peninsula, such that by 2016, we'd acquired most of it. And right now, we have control over or have in friendly hands all but 69 or so acres of the 270 acres. There are 100 odd parcels in this peninsula. And as I say, we control all but probably a handful. The major outliers being a shuttered manufacturing facility and some strips and doors here and there owned by CSX. So in 2016, we were able to sell to Under Armour a large portion of the peninsula on which it was to develop its campus. And in 2017, we were able to enter into a joint venture with the Urban Investment Group at Goldman Sachs. Both of those were critical events, but not all the important events that were necessary in order to make this project a reality. So I'll turn it over to Adam to pick up the story as to what's been happening once we acquired most of the peninsula and got ready to do some development work.
So thank you, Mark, and thank you, Barry, for having us. As Mark indicated, this was largely an industrialized area. So what you see on the screen here is what Port Covington looked like when I knew it. I'm a native Baltimorean, and Port Covington was a place we came to the Walmart, but otherwise there wasn't much here. And so what we came in to do, beginning with the land assemblage and ultimately with the delivery of certain improvements, was to revitalize Port Covington because it has over 2.5 miles of waterfront and extensive waterfront land, which enables a robust and active environment for everyone. And so what we did is we came in and we did some initial projects to get the development itself going. So what you see on the top left is City Garage. That was the municipal repair depot for Baltimore's vehicle fleet for a number of years. And as you can imagine, based on the petroleum in the area, there was some environmental remediation that needed to occur. So in 2015, City Garage began as one of the first redevelopment projects in Port Covington. It's a 136,000 square foot incubation and manufacturing space. It was designed, permitted, constructed, and ultimately conveyed through the Brownfields Revitalization Program in Baltimore. So it's taking brownfield tax credits. And by virtue of being within an enterprise zone as well as taking enterprise zone tax credits. And we'll get to the interplay of those two items with tax increment financing here in a little while. But we also delivered what you see on the far right of your screen on the top right, the Sagamore Spirit Distillery and Rye Street Tavern, both delivered in early 2017. Rye Street Tavern is in partnership with a New York restaurant group, NoHo Hospitality. And Chef Carmelini and his team came down to create one of Baltimore's premier waterfront restaurants. It's immediately adjacent to Sagamore Spirit Distillery. So Maryland, some of you from New York may not know, and you may think because you have the Belmont, are the horse champions of the Northeast, but Maryland is known for its horse racing as well. And so the story of Sagamore Spirit is that Mr. Plank's farm, Sagamore Farm, has a fresh spring aquifer that sits on top of limestone and provides perfect water for horses and for whiskey. And so what we did is through partnership with the Spirit team, is we took what was roughly a 12,000 square foot space in City Garage where Sagamore Spirit began. And they moved into a roughly 40,000 square foot manufacturing and distribution facility on the eastern portion of Port Covington. So that's what you see up here on the top right. This is an important component of our project because as you can see, we started to activate around these improvements. And ultimately, Chapter 1 of Port Covington, we think of Port Covington as a story with chapters as opposed to a development project with phases, is centered around the energy of the distillery and Rye Street Tavern itself. So as Mark alluded, in 2017, the Goldman Sachs Urban Investment Group bought in as the single largest investment in the history of the Urban Investment Group. And they were such a perfect partner for us and we for them because of the community benefits component and the triple bottom line of this project. So I'll speak to it here in a little bit, but as part of the Port Covington redevelopment, we entered into a historic memorandum of understanding and community benefits agreement with the city of Baltimore and the surrounding communities which are immediately adjacent to us, the South Baltimore 6. And what we did is we created the South Baltimore 7 Coalition, a 501c3 nonprofit, which is now the administrator of our community benefits agreement valued over $100 million. And we'll speak to that here in a little bit. But in terms of timeline, in July 2016, Baltimore was undergoing a zoning rewrite. And so we created the Port Covington zones. We have our own zoning districts, PC 1 through 4. Each of them have robust uses, and some of them have certain height limitations, but predominantly the balance of the site has unlimited height and density for nearly every use that you could look to do in a mixed use development. Utilizing that plan, and with the help of Mark Pollak, Ballard, Spahr, and many, many others, we legislated the largest tax increment financing package backed by real estate in the history of Baltimore City. valued at over 600, or rather valued at $660 million in total issuance, with an on-site budget of $535 million. That $535 million goes to construct the roads, infrastructure, parks, green space, and everything necessary to support a new, entirely new neighborhood of a city. So right now, as you saw in that initial picture, there are a couple major arterial roads, but the street grid necessary to support 18 million square feet of vertical density does not exist. And that is the purpose of the TIF, is to pay for the improvements that would otherwise be too costly to redevelop this section of Baltimore. We mentioned Goldman Sachs came in with an equity investment of $233 million, the largest in the history of the Urban Investment Group, and that was September 2017. And then we really got to work on planning what would be Chapter 1, we call Chapter 1B, or the Chapter 1 area. We consider Chapter 1A to be those assets I just discussed with you: City Garage, Rye Street Tavern, Sagamore Spirit Distillery, Nick's Fish House, which we didn't talk about, but I was derelict in doing so, Best Crabs in Baltimore. And so we went to work on what the street network would look like, what some of the first buildings would look like, and eventually broke ground on the horizontal, meaning the roads and the infrastructure, power, water, sewer, telecom, in May of 2019 under developer agreements with the city of Baltimore.
Adam, in terms of the Goldman Sachs relationship, it might be worth mentioning that it was only by virtue of the approvals that were secured in advance of that Goldman Sachs was the least bit interested in joining in with this project. That so critical to that relationship was the securing of the zoning and the authorization for tax increment financing in an amount sufficient to handle the projected 20-year needs of the project. We'll talk a little bit later about the closings that occurred in December, but those were only for the first tranche of TIF bonds, and we're in the $138 million range. We still have an awful lot more authority, which we will use in the future to do the rest of the infrastructure.
That's absolutely right, and a great point, Mark. So another advantage that Port Covington has is its location, right? A lot of people talk about the 3 L's of real estate being location, location, location. Well, we're situated on 2.5 miles of waterfront on the south side of Baltimore, with 3 existing on and off points to and from I-95, which is a short drive from Washington, D.C., and then, of course, up to Philadelphia and New York. We are also proximate to the northeast corridor of the Amtrak line, the busiest corridor in the United States for rail, and less than 10 miles from BWI Airport, which is the busiest airport in the region. So for all of these reasons, including multimodal connectivity, whether light rail, we have a circulator in Baltimore, as well as MTA, through these transit connections, we have a beneficial location and beneficial access, not only to the site, but points north and south, which enable tenants, residents, and patrons to access the site and utilize the site more freely for their lifestyle, whether that's commuting to or from work, or enjoying the offerings in Port Covington or downtown. And I do apologize, this is a big deck, so it takes a minute or two for slides to load. So I mentioned earlier our community benefits agreement. This was extremely important in securing the tax increment financing package, and I think, frankly, is something that is not only important to the project, but something that we believe in and think should be a replicable model of equitable mixed income and mixed use development nationwide going forward. There are a lot of conversations right now around opportunity zones and what community benefits agreements should be utilized when deploying capital in one of these fashions. And we believe that by structuring our community benefits agreement and memorandum of understanding to combat some of the historical inequities, whether in housing or access to jobs, employment, that we have provided an opportunity to affect beneficial outcomes, not only in Port Covington, but for the city of Baltimore and our neighbors immediately adjacent. And so I'm going to go through a couple of these things. Specifically, one innovative process that we utilized, you'll see on the top right, as a $39 million pledge over the life of the project. That $39 million is generated from transaction surcharges and what we call community benefits contributions. And that is ultimately a contribution from for-profit commercial square footage in Port Covington, which is paid annually into a collector entity and distributes dollars 2/3 to the South Baltimore 6 neighborhoods immediately south of us, and 1/3 to citywide initiatives. That is an ongoing revenue stream that every building and every for-profit commercial square foot in Port Covington will generate for our city going forward. And that's been commemorated in our covenants, conditions, and restrictions, as have many other of these initiatives. Another.
And it's probably worth mentioning that for precision, the amount of the charge is 25 cents per square foot per year.
Yep.
That's a portion of the so-called community benefits charge. In addition, whenever there are transfers of property, we impose sort of a surcharge of 1/4 or 1% as an additional contribution to this fund. So it is a long-term funding mechanism that's in place, commemorated through covenants, and will apply throughout the history of the project.
That's right. And so the SB7 Coalition, Inc., on which we have developer seats, utilizes this ongoing funding in addition to some baseline funding that I'll get to here in a minute for its ongoing budget projections and operations, and to affect its strategic plan for the South Baltimore neighborhoods themselves. But I just mentioned the baseline funding. At closing in December, with the issuance of TIF bonds, brought $9 million of what is called baseline funding under our community benefits agreement into play for the communities. And so it was on December 30th that $9 million was wired into an escrow account for the South Baltimore 7 Coalition, and then was ultimately wired to the SB7's investment account. And so now the nonprofit 501c3 has the ability and the wherewithal to affect its strategic plan by virtue of our community benefits agreement, which pledged those initial dollars upon closing of the TIF based on the pay-in schedule as enumerated in 2016. And so those dollars now are going to fund community-based organizations, community-based initiatives, which serve either singular or multiple communities, as well as within a pool for micro grants and business owners for expansion, capacity building, and technical assistance in South Baltimore. Another really important component of our MOU is affordable housing. So you'll see here that we've pledged that 20% of the residential dwelling units in Port Covington will be affordable. And in reality, our obligation is to have a minimum of 12% of the units on site be affordable, and a maximum of 8% can be off site. So as you can imagine, for every 100 units we deliver, 20 must be affordable, and a minimum of 12 must be on site. Well, what we did is we came out of the ground in our first 5 buildings with offerings ranging from 80% of area median income to potentially 30% of area median income across 2 different buildings. And in one building in particular, we utilized an innovative financing structure, which was an 80% market rate, 20% affordable building, utilizing 4% low-income housing tax credits for those 20% units, which were available at 50% of area median income. The way in which we did that was we used the 4% non-competitive credits from Maryland's Department of Housing and Community Development, and we utilized a tax-exempt loan through a seller servicer, which was ultimately provided by Freddie Mac. That loan enabled a construction loan to be levied against the project note. And so ultimately what we did was we utilized opportunity zone equity, 4% low-income housing tax credits, a tax-exempt loan product to finance what is one of the first mixed income affordable buildings in the state of Maryland utilizing this structure. And so we're very proud that this building itself contains 20 units, and that from the beginning on site, we have 20% of our residential offerings are affordable at area median incomes ranging from 80 to 30%.
Let me just interject here for a second. the 20% is significant because the city requirement, sort of an unfunded, easily excusable requirement prior to this project coming online, was 10%. So that we not only met the toothless requirement that was in place, but exceeded it and ended up doubling it. So this was a very significant benchmark that I think a lot of the folks who initially opposed the approval of the TIF financing came to recognize as being critical to the success of the project and the success of the city and its surrounding neighborhoods.
And so that brings us to our Chapter 1B project. So we mentioned that we capitalized on the energy from Sagamore Spirit and Rye Street Tavern, which has tens of thousands of visitors each year. So you can see here on the eastern component of the site, we impacted roughly 60 acres utilizing a major subdivision process. Roughly 40 acres will be newly disturbed, with approximately 20 which were previously improved. And what that will yield is 15 building parcels and roughly 10 acres of new roads and right-of-way that will ultimately be conveyed to Baltimore City in fee simple. We are also developing approximately 10 acres of parks and publicly available green space. Specifically, 2 parks will be funded by tax increment financing bonds. And those 2 parks you will see one is on the waterfront, this area here, which we'll get to in a minute. And one is here called Triangle Park, which also has a sanitary component to it to support our vertical development. So this map here shows you the 15 building parcels in Chapter 1. I mentioned in orange, Rye Street Tavern and Sagamore Spirit Distillery. And so in order to launch the tax increment financing bonds and in order to close on them, we needed to demonstrate that we had the tax increment to service the debt that would be due on those bonds. And in order to do that, to size to the infrastructure cost needed to construct this road network with all of the appurtenant utilities and microbiome retentions and otherwise, we needed to construct 5 buildings. And so we did an intentional building mix of office, retail, residential. Each building has retail on the ground level. And the buildings in blue, E7 and E5A, are office buildings, whereas the buildings in red are residential. E6 being our 80/20 affordable building, E5B being market rate, but having some extended stay units. This was something that corporate tenants and certain patrons had identified as an important component to their ongoing operation. And so this also differentiated some of our residential offering to increase absorption within the pro forma. And then the E1 building, you can see there also has a gray component. That is a roughly 1,000 space parking garage, which also aims to serve these 5 buildings. So these 5 total roughly 1.1 million square feet of vertical development. And so once completed, the tax increment created from them. So essentially we have a base increment of what each parcel is worth. And then when we build the improvement, each parcel will be worth its improved value. And the delta, the increment between that improved value and that base value, is the increment against which tax is levied and ultimately services the debt on these tax increment financing bonds.
Adam, let me just interject here. I don't know the extent to which the folks watching this are familiar with tax increment financing, but it basically is a mechanism for that substitutes for the city's traditional involvement in providing the infrastructure needed for new projects. And what it essentially does is pledge the future incremental taxes generated by the development that would be facilitated by the infrastructure as the security for and source of payment for principal and interest on the bonds that would be issued. And obviously it's very dependent on the faith of the bondholders that the development will occur. And the city of Baltimore, which we'll get into in a little while, was justifiably concerned as well that they not be involved with the issuance of bonds that had any degree of likelihood of not succeeding. So one of the great challenges was essentially getting all the various participants involved in the financing, equity, debt, the city, that everybody else was going to stay involved and participate at the same time. It was sort of a Alphonse and Gaston sort of situation where everybody else said, well, I'll go forward and take the next step if A, B, and C go forward and take their next steps. And that was true for each of the participants. One thing that we should talk a little bit about was the authorization that was secured in 2016 for the TIF financing itself. TIF is a very misunderstood mechanism. And one of our biggest challenges was essentially overcoming a lot of misimpressions and deliberate myths about what TIF involved. There was an awful lot of this headlines with screeching subsidies for billionaires and suggestions that somehow the TIF financing was going to impact everybody's pocketbook by tapping into their property taxes, that it was somehow going to take away from the public services that might otherwise be available. And in order to overcome that kind of mythology, one of the things that I think we did exceptionally well was engage in a public information campaign to make not just the city council members or anyone else involved in the public aid, but the city at large aware of what a TIF was and why it would not do all those things that they were being told it would do. Adam, I don't know if you can cue it up, but we did put together a video that I thought was particularly good at explaining a TIF, probably far better than I could explain it. So why don't we run that just to give folks a good sense of what TIF financing is all about. Those are neighborhood names, by the way. Did we lose the audio to this thing? I thought there was music.
That was fine. I can assure you that there are elected public officials in the city of New York who either could not or would not understand the concept of a TIF. Please go ahead.
No, unfortunately, I'm not sure we've totally convinced everybody in the city government, but we made a good effort, I think.
We did. And so as Mark mentioned, the tax increment financing utilizes the revenues that ultimately would be generated from vertical development, supported by the horizontal improvements. And so what we're showing you here on this slide are our horizontal improvements. We are building, as I mentioned, roughly 10 acres of new roads and rights of way that you see highlighted here in yellow. These create rectilinear building paths, which are extremely efficient and provide direct utility connections to the new infrastructure installations. We're also developing parks and green space, which we'll get to here in a moment. But as you can imagine, some of this waterfront had deteriorated over time. So one of the improvements that we had to put in here was a structural bulkhead, which ultimately holds back the land in this Chapter 1 area. Along the waterfront here, we have created what we call a Maritime Master Plan. And that Maritime Master Plan aims to capitalize on the waterfront through both its history and its resiliency. So ultimately, in addition to the 5 buildings that we're constructing now, we aim to renovate the existing piers to create them interactive for the use of the public, for understanding what it meant to have a coal car climbing 2.5 stories along the water to dump coal into a ship that was taking it across the ocean, or vice versa, and what it means to have all of the wildlife offerings that we have here as well. So through that, we have identified certain improvements, inclusive of something we call Marsh Park, which is a biological wetland and a habitat restoration project, which will occur in the cove right in this area. And it's meant to utilize repurposed dredge material from the Maryland Port Administration to both stabilize the shoreline, as well as to create a resiliency area, which will further reduce phosphorus and nitrogen introduction into the Chesapeake Bay, which, I think folks are probably aware that the Chesapeake Bay is our largest watershed in the region. And we've had an immense effort to clean up the bay over the preceding decades. And so ultimately we aim to contribute to that, both through installation of hard plantings along the waterfront, but also we have funded what I believe is the 4th trash wheel in Baltimore. So for anybody who's come to Baltimore in the last 7 to 8 years, we have a series of trash wheels around the outfalls that come into the harbor from the different estuary streams and source watershed. And a lot of that, unfortunately, has waterborne plastics and other particulates. So what we have done is we've started utilizing solar-powered trash wheels, which literally pluck the trash out of the water and are hauled off in dumpsters. And so to date, hundreds of tons have been removed from the water. I can't quote all of the exact numbers, but we're very excited that on the southern waterfront, where Port Covington sits along the middle branch of the Patapsco, we're getting our own new water wheel upcoming this year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the, Barry, was there a?
Yeah, just a banker asked about the recourse on the TIF. I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer. What is the recourse if things go south?
Let me just talk a little bit about that. TIF bonds are basically supported in several ways. Traditionally, they're supported by a pledge of the incremental tax revenues, but in some jurisdictions, and Baltimore is included among them, there's also a special tax that's imposed on properties within a district that's created in conjunction with the creation of the development district within which TIF bonds are utilized to, in effect, cover the shortfall. In other words, if for whatever reason the 5 buildings are not developed at all, or are developed at a pace far slower than projected, there are going to be shortfalls with regard to the planned debt service on the bonds. And at that point in time, special taxes would be imposed on the properties within the district. And the requirement of the city was that all the properties that we controlled had to be put into that district. So that to the extent that there are shortfalls, we are putting our own properties at risk, and they can be foreclosed upon. But that was not all. One of the things that I think both the city recognized and the underwriters for the bonds recognized was that we were taking advantage of a lot of government incentive programs, including most specifically being in what's called an enterprise zone in Maryland, and also having the benefit of being a brownfields that has been remediated. And in enterprise zones, there are property tax abatements that are available for 10 years that start at 80% of the otherwise payable taxes. On top of that, the brownfields program also provides for a property tax abatement that is 70% of whatever is left over after the enterprise zone abatement is put in place. So that in effect, for at least 5 years, these properties will only pay 6% of the taxes that would otherwise be payable. And so obviously the special tax becomes critical. We also put in place an arrangement by which the property owners of these 5 projects, each of which will be owned by a special purpose entity, will be responsible for paying some portion of those abated taxes to the developer, so that the developer who is holding the undeveloped property on which most of the burden of special taxes would ultimately fall would have to make up some of the special tax burden that would otherwise fall upon the development entity. On top of that, we were also required to set up a couple of escrow arrangements, one of which was essentially tied to projected shortfalls or in valuations. And so as a result, we set up one escrow that I guess it was close to $10 million was set aside in an escrow arrangement. And we set up another escrow arrangement that protected the city by having us post a surety bond in a significant amount that presumably could be called upon if there were further shortfalls. And this is all on top of the creation of a capitalized interest account in the structuring the bonds, which covered the interest payments that would otherwise be due for 2.5 years. So there are an awful lot of protections in there for the bondholders, which I guess provided more than sufficient confidence to the marketing of the bonds. And the bonds, when they were offered for marketing, were oversubscribed to the extent of almost 10 to 1. I think we had over $1 billion in proposed purchases for $138 million in bonds. So it was critical to put in place all these protected mechanisms, and also resulted in an interest rate that was considerably lower than most of us expected. It was less than 4%. So that's the way it's protected. And I think the question was, what happens if they go into default, notwithstanding all these arrangements? Basically, the city would foreclose on them the way they would foreclose on any other property that's not paid its property taxes. Just that simple. So that if the developer was prepared to walk away from this multi-$100 million investment in land and existing projects, they could do so, and the city would have the property and could turn it around and resell it to make up whatever was deficient in the way of funds for the payment of the TIF bonds. So it's a fairly secure arrangement.
Yeah, and Mark, that's a great point. And one other thing I would add is it is the security of the sponsors themselves, which I think is also a testament to the ultimate pricing and sale. Investors need to believe in the sponsors in addition to the underwriting. And so the partners in this deal, I think, also provide some of that solid ground for underwriters and purchasers. So going back, I just wanted to show these 5 buildings here. These are the 5 buildings which constitute the vertical development, which services the debt on the TIF bonds themselves. And as Mark alluded, each was purchased by an SPE, a special purpose entity, 4 of which were opportunity zone entities, and 1 of which utilized conventional equity. And so the 4 which utilized opportunity zone equity or SPEs owned by a qualified opportunity zone business. And that qualified opportunity zone business in turn was wholly owned by a qualified opportunity zone fund. That qualified opportunity zone fund was raised, we raised about $154 million of capital for these 4 buildings. That opportunity zone equity then sits within the fund and flows through the qualified opportunity zone business to the single purpose entity itself. And so when we transacted the closing, Mark and an army of lawyers put together a very voluminous closing memorandum, which included essentially the dominoes which needed to fall in order to affect this transaction appropriately. And so, when we say we had to coordinate each person taking a step forward together, not only each step towards closing, but each step of closing had to be done extremely intentionally to preserve not only the opportunity zone benefits, but to ensure that the flow of funds was appropriately handled. So the complexities of this transaction, are myriad. But in and of itself, it was 5 pad sales which supported the tax increment financing. And those 5 pad sales, when occurred, then transitioned into a closing of the associated debt subsequent to the land purchase and equity, and then ultimately the closing of the TIF bonds themselves. Once the TIF bond underwriters and the city was comfortable that closing had occurred on the construction debt, the construction equity, and the acquisition of the land had occurred, so they and their bondholders had certainty on execution of the transaction. So this building here, E7 Rye Street Market, is a roughly 292,000 square foot office and retail building. Retail on the ground floor here. Baltimore is built around its great markets. For any of you who have ever visited Baltimore, I grew up, I lived by Cross Street Market for about a decade. So we'll have Rye Street Market in Port Covington. We're going to capitalize, as we mentioned, on that energy from Sagamore Spirit Distillery, creating a flush, curbless Cromwell Street, realigning an existing street to create an area prime for festivals and outdoor use and enjoyment by all. E5A is our traditional office building. This is hyper efficient, roughly 97% efficient, so a very low core factor. And this building sits on the western component of the site and is envisioned to house some of the larger footprint traditional tenants. Parcel E5B, this is our extended stay concept with market rate offerings. This is a little bit of a higher end offering, and as I mentioned, we differentiated our residential to ensure that absorption was appropriate based on our underwriting and based on the market conditions that we're seeing based on our research. E1, I mentioned, this is the building with the garage, roughly 1,000 spaces, as well as a large format retail envisioned to be a grocer. And then Triangle Park sitting here. You can also see our street typologies include large, lush microbiome retention facilities, protected bike lanes and pedestrian areas. This is actually our highest trafficked street. This is Atlas Street, our heavy lifting street, and it is the widest and largest. Port Covington was meant to maintain a pedestrian scale to prioritize the individual over the motorist. And so at completion, Chapter 1 will total roughly 3.4 million square feet. We are embarking, as we mentioned, on the roughly 1.1 million square feet comprising Chapter 1B, which supports the roughly $139 million of infrastructure improvements necessary to support this very large development on Baltimore's waterfront. So recognizing that Mark and I could talk for hours and hours about this, and we often do, whether early in the morning or late at night, we wanted to leave some time for questions or any other items that folks may want to discuss.
Yeah.
I have
Well, if you note, just when we closed on all these transactions on December 30th of this year, we essentially provided for or secured the existing and future investment of well over $1 billion, which for Baltimore is big dollars. And so it was critical, but it also required 14 separate transactions in order to make it happen. So it really was very much a matter of orchestrating, which took many weeks to figure out, but orchestrating all these steps that had to occur more or less simultaneously, yet obviously in seriatim form. So.
And I would just add to that, Barry, if I may, that not only did all of it have to happen in such an orchestrated manner, but it was happening during a global pandemic when our records office was closed, and so the order of recording becomes even more at issue. And so making sure that everything happened in the way it needed to happen, given all of the hurdles that we faced over the preceding years, including this pandemic, I think was something we were all very, very proud of.
And not to say that the banks were tremendously adventuresome, but I think it took a lot of faith on their part to commit to financing these projects. But they were not silly about it. They require that all the equity go in before $1 of bank financing goes into any one of these projects. So that the banks were cautious, as they ought to be in this situation.
Okay, my first question is to allow each of you a few seconds, in just a few seconds, to talk about the team. How many people were involved in this? And is there anybody in particular you want to mention? Perhaps, as I
Mark
said, besides that.
So I would estimate that we had upwards of 200 people working on this project, and that's probably a lowball number. So that includes our partners, that includes attorneys, that includes lenders, that includes equity partners, that includes the state, that includes the city, that includes the underwriters, that includes the construction team, the design teams, the engineering teams, the legal teams, the environmental consultants, the list goes on and on. And so to orchestrate something like this, it does take an army. And, I think something that we're very grateful for, is the Ballard team, as well as, our experienced team in the city. I think both the leaders of our organization at Weller Development, the leaders at Goldman Sachs, and frankly, the leaders in Baltimore City, our elected officials, our councilmen, our representatives, our delegates, our state senators, and otherwise, all had to come together to believe in this vision. And I think that not only are all of those individuals extremely important to make the transaction happen, but the community is probably the most important component of that. And no offense to Mark, who was the hero of this project, I think from the outside counsel side, having community standing with us to execute on this, to continue to testify at every planning commission, board of estimates, board of finance approval. It speaks to the power of an aligned vision for a project and to an aligned vision for revitalization of a city. And so, I would thank our partners in the SB6 specifically, Westport, Lakeland, Mount Winans, Curtis Bay, Cherry Hill, and Brooklyn, as well as all of our citywide partners on the workforce development training side. And, the list goes on. But I think it's really important to note that anytime you're doing one of these really large urban revitalization projects, that you're impacting a city, you're impacting a neighborhood. And in order to do that, we're not going to be successful unless those neighborhoods are also successful. So I would say that to me, that was an extremely important component and probably the most important teammate that we had, other than Mark Pollak.
All I can add is there were 14 other law firms involved in the transaction. So you can imagine what that was like. Not to belittle the importance of the legal profession, but herding cats is an understatement there. So,
Okay, I have another. Next question I got was: are there sustainability standards and resilience standards that you used? This is a waterfront project, contaminated site.
Mm-hmm.
Were there particulars other than the government required ones?
So, the government mandated requirements are those which we're meeting from a hard development standpoint. We've mentioned that we're part of the Brownfields Revitalization Incentive Program that ultimately provides a tax credit through a qualified improvement. Port Covington, by virtue of its history, does have some petroleum particulates and other environmental soil conditions, but ultimately our cap installation is quite simple. It's a filter fabric with 2 feet of clean fill. When we speak to resiliency, however, that's an issue. That is a matter of where we went to the waterfront and said, how can we reduce infiltration of harmful nutrients into the water itself? From a resiliency perspective, you can do things like raising finished floor elevation to combat flood, or look at other waterborne resiliency measures. But for us, because the Chesapeake Bay's health is such an important component, not only of our project, but the vitality of our region, we identified shoreline stabilization and reduction of phosphorus and nitrogen as a really important component of what we aim to do. So we have partnerships with groups who work in that space, whether creation of floating wetlands or installation of the dredge material, as I mentioned. And so ultimately, we aim to have a beneficial impact on the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in addition to the landside improvements relating to soil.
Energy sources and energy requirements in terms of energy performance?
Sure. So we're tapping into the local grid network, but we actually are looking at some innovative on-site beneficial reuse facilities, whether in the wastewater utility space or in the generation space itself. I think that is something that's worth mentioning is we have certain sanitary improvements funded by the tax increment financing package, which enhance Baltimore's sanitary system as well. And so through all of these measures, we aim to improve not only water quality in the Bay, but to have as small of an environmental impact as we can, given the size of this new development.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that's about architecture and design. I think you mentioned the names of the architects, but a little bit about sort of the design concept.
Sure. So Elkis Manfredi was the master plan architect who came in and worked with us to create the initial master plan in 2015 and ultimately garnered approval in 2016. They since worked with us to change some of the eastern components of the plan. So we had some curved roads and some angular buildings, which we changed into what you saw today, rectilinear, more efficient buildings, which can be constructed in a more efficient manner. We had several architects. Actually, each building had a different one. So we had Morris Ajmi out of New York worked on E7, Rye Street Market, in partnership with a group called MGMA out of Northern Virginia. We also had Horde Copeland Mocht did a building for us. Tordy Gallus and Partners did a building for us. And then we have Hersh Landscape Architects out of Chicago. And Core Studios is a landscape architect out of Baltimore, a local woman-owned firm. So they partnered up on our streetscape design in certain private areas. And then we also have Unknown Studios, Moffitt and Nickel and PIKL working on parks and publicly available green space. Moffitt also worked on our Maritime plan, and then STV Inc. is our engineer of record on the infrastructure project itself. So we have a veritable team, each working on different components. And then I should also mention that we have 5 different general contractors working on the site. Whiting Turner is building the E7 building, as well as all of the roads and infrastructure. And then we have E6 is Bazzuto Contracting, as is E5B. E5A is Clark Construction, and E1 is CBG. Through all of these groups, not only are we looking to hire local Baltimore City residents through our MOU, but we have also deployed more than $29 million to minority and women-owned businesses, whether general or subcontractors.
Every one of those people is going to say, "This is my project."
One hopes.
One of the things that Adam alluded to, and it's worth repeating, is that as part of our MOU with the city, we have committed on behalf of our contractors and subcontractors that we are going to meet or exceed the minimum requirements for minority and women-owned businesses. Those standards are 27%, Adam, for
27% MBE,
and 10% for women. In addition, we also have an obligation to make sure that at least 51% of the on-site workers are Baltimore City residents. So we have a strong local hiring obligation, a strong MBE, WBE obligation, as well as the commitments that we've made to the community. This is an essential element in terms of our relationship with the city and the various communities throughout the city.
Okay, final question. What's the big picture? What happens in the next phases?
So we have a number of ideas for what happens in the next phase. So for those in the Baltimore area, you may be aware that we've been leasing or actively leasing a life sciences building on an adjacent parcel to the 5 buildings that we spoke about today. We have other interest in other parcels in Port Covington, or rather Port Covington Chapter 1. So we're looking at designing some of the buildings in the remaining 10 parcels themselves. We also have some activity west of Hanover Street. So basically what we're looking at is what vertical improvements do we need to tee up our next tranche of TIF, and what infrastructure do we need to support those vertical improvements so we can embark on this journey yet again.
Mark, I'll give you the final word.
No, I think Adam said it well. This is a project that probably will last longer than I'll be practicing law. I think I'm looking forward to sticking with it as long as I can. It's been one of the hallmark projects of my nearly 50 years of practicing law. And it's been an absolute delight working with professionals like Adam, who are, I think has been clearly demonstrated, knows this thing inside out, from A to Z and beyond. So, we truly have an exceptional team working on this project.
Okay, well, my one promise was to start on time and end on time. So I will thank you both. Is everything I expected and more. Boy, I learned a lot about tax increment financing and recourse, among other topics, but a terrific project. And thank you both. We will make the recording available probably in a few days. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me and I'll pass them along.